Good evening and most welcome to 729 of our H series. And this lovely evening I will take up Barbara Twersky's book Mind in Motion, because it's just absolutely fabulous. I know that the husband of Barbara Twersky is even more famous than her. He was cooperating among other people with Kahneman, as you might know, but her insights are just extraordinary. It's like she's opening up knowledge about mind. What does mind do? What does it have for sort of working purpose? So we can, for the first time, look into mind and see what it is. And I named this lecture Space as a Function of Mind. And that is one of the insights from Tversky. She shows that space is fundamental to what is mind and understanding. And she sees how in action we create understanding. Let me give you some examples. She writes here about perspective, how to get perspective. And you can use that with many senses. You have near and you have far. There is above and within, outside and inside. There's global and we have local. There is peripheral and there's focal. There's yours and there's mine. Each of these are spatial and each goes abstract. Many are encapsulated into epigrams, not necessarily constantly. As for all epigrams, the big picture, the devil is in the details. To see the world in a grain of sand. And I especially like that because we mentioned William Blake a couple of times before in different contexts. She continues in the next paragraph. Near and far. We begin with an all but nevertheless true aphorism. Can't see the forest for the trees. When we are close, we see trees. Only from a distance can we see the forest. From close, you see the details. From afar, you see the broad outlines. Now, which is better? The usual answer, it depends. But first, let's examine the phenomenon that imagined distance affects thinking in a range of tasks. In particular, a distant focus is accompanied by generalities, abstraction, greater certainty, whereas a close focus is accompanied by specific details and greater uncertainty. Here are a few of the studies that are consistent with the analysis. People are faster to read words denoting certainty, like sure, when they are located close in drawn scene, and faster to read words expressing uncertainty, like maybe, when the words are placed at a distance in a scene. When they imagine the distant future, people judge that others and themselves will be more consistent than when they imagine the near future. This implies that we are more likely to get out of ourselves when we take a distant perspective on ourselves. According to the fundamental attribution error, we see our own behavior as more dependent on external influences, so more variable and uncertain, but we see others' behavior is more dependent on traits, so more consistent, and predictable. Distancing ourselves from ourselves make us see our own selves like selves of others. That, I have to say in parentheses, is what they call in psychology global thinking. It becomes more certain because of the distance. End of parentheses. People use more abstract words to describe their distant past than their close past. Together, the studies show that taking a distant spatial perspective induces people to think more abstractly. This suggests that taking a distant spatial perspective should abet creative problem solving, and in fact children and adults are more likely to solve insight problems after they have been primed with a distant perspective. But distance is only one dimensional, and space has 3 dimensions, though it's often flattened to 2 in the mind and on the page, of course. Instead of thinking along a single line, let's now pop overhead. And now it becomes even more interesting. Above and within, outside and inside. Networks and lines are simple structures that contain and connect ideas. Networks are service. They provide outside perspective from above, like maps. Lines are routes. We're on them. They give us inside perspectives. Service are spaces. Routes are sequences of actions. Inside perspective along routes vary in imagined distance with consequences. People who imagine themselves on East Coast judge the distance between San Francisco and Salt Lake City to be smaller than people who imagine themselves on the West Coast. Differences in distance between near things are exaggerated relative to distances between far things, which get minimized. A phenomenon you now know is characteristic of the approximate estimation system. You can also see that time too can be viewed from an inside point of view, with the future in front and the past behind. But time can also be viewed from an outside point of view, as in the calendar. Outside and inside a perspective, maps and routes, networks and paths pervade many kinds of information. And now it gets more intricate. Route/survey. I should write that up. Survey. We don't have any confusion. Survey. It has a homonym. Path. Overview. Procedure. Organization, solution, and problem space. Routes are essentially sets of directions, sequences of turns at landmarks, strings of action at choice points, paths or procedures that will take you from A to B, directions to bake a cake or fillet a fish, or solve an algebra problem, or put something together, be it Lego or furniture, are similar strings of action, here on objects rather than at landmarks. So are explanations of cell division, or how an engine works, or how to complete a tax form, or buy a ticket online. step-by-step actions that lead to an outcome. Guaranteed success recipes. Maps are not like that. They are instructions or recipes. They do not provide routes, procedures, or sets of action. Maps are service of a space of possibilities. Maps provide an overview, a skeleton of the organization of a set of places, or objects, or times, or organisms, or ideas. Overviews enable the evaluation of many paths, perhaps to select one, but they don't favor anyone. They tell you what's there and how it's arranged. They show you how things are related to each other, but they don't tell you what to do. You have to figure that out. You are the one that walks the path or do the map. But the overviews give you, or should give you, the information you need to do that. And much more, sometimes too much more, too many places or objects or ideas, and too many relationships among them, too many possibilities. Then it takes creativity to discover fallacious paths to find a good solution, whether to start and how to proceed. Routes show a single set of actions. Service show a large set of possible actions. Routes are active and service are static. Routes are egocentrics, and you can say that maps are allocentrics. Route is you stand on the route and you walk fast, so take stance where you start. Whereas a map is allocentric, it doesn't have a center, it doesn't have a beginning and origin. And that's the difference. And Barbara Tversky is referring, among other, this very interesting survey and experimentation using people in the ages 18 to 65 and let them solve problems while they're being filmed, them unbeknownst. And 75% were using their hands in a very specific way. And depending how they use their hands, that's the way they solve the problem. So we can solve a problem with different tools. And depending on the tools, you get different opportunities. A route is not the same as a map. And that goes for many different things. In one of the examples, it was an engine, a gasoline engine, that were to be understood, and a specific part. It was a piston that should go up and down, and we were supposed to understand how it worked, how the force came over. And whether you use a route to understand that. Route, you put yourself inside the engine and you walk the way as the procedure does the engine. Whereas a map would be that you look at the engine from a little distance. You see how it's working. Almost like watching a motor from a TV or in reality. And it showed that if you take the route alternative, it would be easier to understand sequencing in the engine, because the different pistons, they take different turns. There are usually 4 of them, and it starts with number 1 and it goes to number 3 and it goes to number 2 and number 4, and then it starts over again. That's the rhythm of an engine, and that could be very hard to understand if you use the map. You just look at it. But if you put the route alternative, that is, you put yourself into the engine, and then you follow the engine first, 1 piston, then number 3, and then number 2, and then number 4. By following it, you can understand it. And the odd thing, this is exactly the same thing if you were to learn maybe a new path in the city, going from the bank to your home. What would be easiest to understand the route? Would it be to look at the map and try to memorize the different points? Or actually walk between the home and the bank? It's almost 3 times easier if you walk the distance, if you do it with your own body. And now comes the even more interesting point. If you, when you're sitting down, don't walk, but you imagine yourself to walk to the bank from your house. So you see the different blocks, shops, restaurants, crossings in the road, and flag posts, lamp posts, you name it, 5 posts, people. Would that be easier or worse than just having the map in front of you? Actually, still, if you don't really walk, it's still twice as good to imagine yourself walking. And the reason for that is when you yourself walk, if you put the egocentric view, you are active. Whereas you look at the map, and this doesn't matter if it's a map in your head or an actual map, you learn slower. So what Barbara Tversky explains here is something I've been looking for a long time. It's more explanations what it means to be embodied in knowledge, to have the knowledge in the body. It literally means to put the body in the position. But the odd thing, it doesn't mean anything for us. We need more flesh to the matter to understand what it is to have an embodied knowledge. It means that you put yourself in the situation of doing something, whether it's to walk to the bank or understand an engine. And oddly enough, this also goes to understanding language, words in a book, words that should explain to you, for instance, the banking system of Ecuador or something similar. If you use a map and you just see the descriptions of the banking system, it would be rather tough to get the memory to stick. But it would be even harder to understand how it works. And you must remember now, you haven't been in contact with this thing. You haven't been to a bank in Ecuador. You hadn't made a deposit ever. Listen now. Take the route example and place yourself in the situation of making a deposit at the Bank of Ecuador. If you start to do that, Barbara Tversky has shown the possibility of you understanding the whole thing more than doubles. Actually, it's almost triples. And that is once more the egocentrical view. And I guess you by now see how this goes very close together with the findings of Johnson and Lakoff that show that we use directions in the world in different ways. We have egocentric, where for instance say in front of us, back of us, to the left, to the right. And we have, for instance, in Kenya, people who use an allocentric directional. They use a mountain, and everything is organized around this mountain. And that actually makes it harder at some times to understand how they should move. You see, directions are always dependent on from which start you take. And in the end, you need to understand the whole thing with yourself, because you are the one who's going to do the walk in the end. And if it's not you who's going to make the walk, you have to explain it to somebody else, and still you are the one who have to have that knowledge embodied. So it's an opening to understand what abstracting is. And abstracting is not as far away as you usually think. Actually, as to cite Lakoff, abstracting is the most bodily we can ever do. The nouns are much more transcendental than the abstract thinking. Actually, things like relationships, reference, and those things are very much embodied in the living system because they are connected to ourselves. And all understanding in different ways take as a starting point ourselves. And I would say that what Barbara Tversky does, she is opening up understanding of mind. Mind is no longer this black box we mentioned before. I think we had 5 different descriptions at one lecture. Bucket theory, the mind as a bucket, I think that's from Putnam. And there is also a recording machine, I think that is from Dennett. All these different models, they are pinpointing there's something wrong with the system. Putnam means it's weird to say that the mind is it's like a bucket you put things into. But what these metaphors do, they hide what's inside. It takes away us knowing what's happening inside the mind. What is this, in a general way, thinking? How do we relate? Why do we have all these positions up, above, front, further, distance, and all that? Barbara Tversky is the most eloquent describer of this, and she actually opened up the mind. What's happening inside the mind? And no longer do we have to say, somewhere here in this black sphere or box, there is mind, and we have no idea what it does. And here's the hard problem, why we have the hard problem. That's another thing to go into, and I shouldn't go into that. But in a way, she solves the hard problem, because when mind stops to be a mystery, when we stop to have this distance with the space outside our mind and another space in our mind, Barbara Tversky shows that the spaces are the same. It's the same space. It's impossible to separate them. And this is exactly how it started in the cave. Abstract thinking, conceptual thinking started on a wall with carvings. And when you see that, you understand it's impossible to get to that point without some implement to scrabble on the wall and then make relationship on the wall. And then, as I said those times, decontextualize, and then you can recontextualize. And once you've done it with your hand on a wall, you can do it in your mind. And this is what's happened. Human beings develop more and more advanced tools. The tool had dual purpose. First, they all helped us in our daily lives, with our harvest, to defend us against enemies, to make our living more habitable, to get rid of problems with pests, to cook our food, you name it. But the second thing is, they are helping with the thinking. They are what thinking is. Because what they show is actions with directions. And now you start understanding that lettering is one of the most important tools for abstract thinking. And it remains both space and something symbolic at the same time, because they occupy space. They have a sequencing, and the sequence is not unimportant. It's very important, because in that you have the meaning. it's a sort of tool for meaning. It's highly interesting, and now we realize that civilization and thinking go hand in hand. Thinking is not something God-given from nowhere. It's actually in this reality. And I think that could be the killing stone for the blank slate theory. It would be impossible to think human minds as completely blank after this. Even though it's a completely nonsensical theory, I think this is the absolute killer. Because in this scenario, it doesn't even mean anything to be blank. How could you describe it? What is empty mind? It doesn't mean anything. For mind to be something, all those things needs to be there, at least some. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in their mind to speak of. I should mention one more thing here, and I hope I won't spend the whole night reading the book. That would be the most dangerous. I need to put a clock on this. One thing that we mentioned briefly, like from three or four different areas before, like quantum theory, classical physics, Lakoff. We spoke about mathematics, we spoke about ordinal numbers and cardinal numbers. What they imply is causality of some sort. And causality, much interesting, it's something that starts with an order. And here is a good example of that, is from the Valley of Kings in Egypt. And here is a linear and a causal order. And I think it goes like this actually. It looks that way. This is the invention of order, of causality. And causality is something extremely helpful. Causality can look different, but I have a hard time thinking, I mentioned before, the cave people of the Lavascaux down in the northern Pyrenees in southern France. When you see the drawings they made, it's in some senses it's obvious causality as the Egyptians showed it still hadn't developed at that stage. It's a more advanced thing. And when it comes to causality, it's a little bit like looking at something at a distance and then being close. You are being close in each step, that one thing goes to another thing. Then you are being close. That's every knot of the chain. But then you distance yourself, and then you can say something is happening over time, something general. And all of a sudden you have a specific sense of time, a general time. And I would say this is an advent of something that in the end would become general time. And sure, by the Egyptian, it's a long way until we have general times. Still in the early Middle Ages, we were speaking at least about something between 10 to 15 times. And they were not translatable to each other. The biggest time was, of course, the 1 year harvest period. But then you went into smaller harvest, and you had the milking period, you had the lifetime of a hen, and you had all these things. When you were living next to a river, you usually had ebb and tide and those things, and they could regulate. We were listening to the other day about some Maori woman, Irene, and she spoke about the moon, and that the people from her country, I think that would have been the North Island in New Zealand, they used the moon to tell the time, because apparently that country is pervaded by rivers from all directions and the sea around them. And they have very big difference when it comes to ebb and tide. Not like Sweden, more like England or some of those countries where there's several meters of water difference. It's kind of scary actually. It's one of those things you don't know, and it actually influences language. I should mention it by then. We went to England many years ago. I didn't know about this big difference in England between ebb and tide. So I remember we were sitting against some cliffs, and they were quite high. And it was sort of a bay, and I didn't think much of that. And then I saw water come rushing in. And in the beginning we thought it was really fun. Look, the water is getting closer and how quick it is. And in the end we understood we were cut off. We could not get back to the path because we were like in the inside of the water, already covered both paths. So in the end we had to wet all our clothes and our backpacks to swim back actually to the path. I don't know what would have happened. And of course on the way back we saw all these warning signs, but we ignored because we were so tired on a long trip. And of course we were young and thought it was fun. We didn't really believe a tide could be something to be afraid of. And I think the tide in that specific area was the equivalence of 20 feet. 20 foot is a lot of difference. That changes the opportunity to use causality and time quite differently, because solar time and lunar time are not the same. They give a different rhythm, because in the lunar time the lunar time doesn't fit our sleeping time. Whereas the solar time, the sun is always up when we are awake, and the sun is usually down when we are asleep. When the moon doesn't work that way. It has a special system. So that goes across day and night. But that could be good to know that a different counting where day and night is not included. It's other things. But causality developed to become more generalized in the end of the Middle Ages, and already by the 16th century they only had 3 different times. And I think today we made a huge problem. We made our different times to fit with one singular, and the big problem with that is that singular time is allocentric. It's outside ourselves, and it's even outside of nature. And that makes it a really bad center, because it doesn't adjust to the different thing. It doesn't have causality in that way. It doesn't follow the movement of the earth, our needs, or our bodies, or anything. So it's a bit problematic. When you read Barbara Tversky, you understand that once you're starting to opening up what mind is, you can go further and go into space. And I think if you understand what's happening, you're no longer in the danger of making confusing errors. Because if you start to understand what's actually happening inside our mind, making it clear what is everything we are doing, because we never put any names to this before. Barbara Tversky is the first I read. Well, Lakoff begins the project in my idea, and you have of course Langacker who goes into cognitive grammar, but Barbara Tversky takes it one notch further. And all of a sudden you start to understand, that's thinking. That is mind. It does things. It has an action. It's not just a blank mirror that sees the world like this, like a zombie that I think Ian McGilchrist called the one man a zombie. And for a good reason, of course. If we have this passive role of seeing and observing, where consciousness is just a mirroring effect, that's pretty horrid actually. It doesn't do anything but mirroring what's around it. And that makes it completely dependent on what's around it. And I think this process makes both the mind passive and the object's dead. I'm pretty sure this goes to explain why modern people have so little experience of color, depth, difference in reality. When people are really investigated, what do they experience? Their world is completely bland. It lacks differences. It lacks depth in all different ways. And it's easily proven, and the experience been plentiful. I think Ian McGilchrist takes up at least 800, something of that vicinity, that we today don't notice reality. And you can remove quite big objects, for instance, in a room. Let people go into them, for instance, 12 people, take them out, and you take out big things like a sofa, 2 windows, something like that. And they don't notice anything. That's kind of scary. So somehow all these different ideas we took up, Ian McGilchrist and Lakoff, and also of course Richard A. Lind, Langacker and Kahneman, they all show the same thing. Why is it we don't perceive reality anymore? Why are we shut out from reality in our own body? But I think when it comes to opening up and see what process makes things real, I think Barbara Tversky is in a certain way quite unique. And it will be very interesting to see if Ian McGilchrist heard about her. Well, I had to stop them. I'm getting too enthusiastic here with Barbara Tversky. Well, until next time, I think that's going to be pretty soon. I'm going to hit the book and read it from folder to folder. I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant good night.
Thank you.